Welcome to the Business Talk, a global podcast series that highlights distinguished faculty members and their impactful scholarly contributions. I'm Deepak, your host from India. We are honored to welcome Dr. Anthony Alexander as our distinguished guest on Business Talk today. Before we get started, I would like to introduce the guest for today's episode. Dr. Anthony Alexander is an associate professor in operations management at the University of Sussex Business School, where his work sits at a rare crossroads where global supply chains meet the urgent realities of sustainability, deforestation, and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Rather than treating sustainability as a corporate checkbox, Dr. Alexander approaches it as a decision science challenge. His research draws on decision theory, game theory, and stakeholder analysis to help businesses and policymakers navigate what the often called weak problems, a term coined by Professor Rittel and Professor Weber in the early 1970s to describe complex multi-actor dilemmas such as tropical deforestation and sustainable food systems where no single actor holds the solution. His scholarly footprints in wide and growing, with over 1,250 citations and an H index of 13. Dr. Alexander has published in leading journals, including the International Journal of Operations and Production Management, Journal of Business Ethics and Science Advances, collaborating with researchers across Cardiff, University of London, Stockholm School of Economics, and institutions in Latin America and Scandinavia. Before academia, Dr. Alexander served as a research director at the Ellen Baxter Associates and authored Britain's New Towns, Garden Cities to Sustainable Communities, published by Routledge in 2009, a work that reflects his long-term standing interest in how systems of human settlement and enterprise can be designed for resilience and long-term flourishing. Methodologically, Dr. Alexander is primarily a qualitative researcher, leading interview-driven inquiries into how organizations manage sustainability-related supply risks, biodiversity commitments, and SDG alignment, bridging theory with the lived complexity of global supply chains. Today on Business Talk, Dr. Anthony Alexander challenges us to rethink everything we assume about supply chains, drawing from his landmark research on navigating the so-called new normal in operations management. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Anthony Alexander to the conversation. Professor Anthony, it's a distinct privilege to welcome you to Business Talk. We are grateful to you for accepting our kind invitation.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Professor, the phrase new normal has become almost a cliche post-pandemic, but your paper gives a real academic weight. In your view, what makes the current era genuinely unprecedented for operations and supply chain managers versus just another cycle of disruption?
Well, thank you for your interest and for that question. The phrase "the new normal," in a sense, what's different about the normal state of things now is just the rate of disruption. We've had just in, if you think back the beginning of the 21st century, we had 9/11, the war in Afghanistan, then in Iraq. We have the global financial crisis from 2008. In the UK, we had Brexit. In Ukraine, they had the Russian takeover of Crimea. Then we had COVID. Then we had the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and currently the Israel and USA war against Iran. So there's this succession of major geopolitical crises, and in a sense there's a connection between them because each one changes the situation, and that sense of the rate of change is really just kind of accelerating, it seems. Now there's an interesting pair of papers by Martin Christopher and Matthias Hollweg. The first one published in 2011 called Supply Chain 2.0, talking about supply chains in an age of turbulence, and then a follow-up in 2017, Supply Chain 2.0 Revisited. And they look back over the sort of the disruptions, major geopolitical economic disruptions, and find these different waves of turbulence versus stability, and say that supply chain management as a subject itself came out of a relatively calm period in the early 1980s, and that period of calm allows you to sort of optimize your processes a bit. It gives you a sense of control over your management operations and strategy. But then if you think about recent years, essentially they just get a bit more bunched up, those disruptions. So that then prompts this whole discussion about how does supply chain managers respond to that sort of ever-changing, ever more complex environment. And we don't only have these sort of major sort of crisis events. I mean, you have something like when the Suez Canal became blocked, it was a sort of a singular, very rapid, large effect event. But then after a time, once it had been resolved and the backlog had cleared, that was the end of that event. But against that, you then get long-term trends that can also be very, very significant on the nature of the environment. And one of those is technology. So the role of information technology, and now we talk about AI as being this sort of significant change that we can say now means we're in a new normal, not the old normal.
Professor, you co-chaired the European Operations Management Association 2021 conference at a remarkable inflection point. Researchers were essentially studying the pandemic while still living inside it. How did this shape the quality and nature of the research that came out of that event?
So the paper that we're talking about here about the role of the new normal came out of this conference, the Euroma 2021 conference. It was a summary of some of the different themes that were there in the conference. And Euroma is the European Operations Management Association. They have an annual conference. And in 2020, that conference was due to take place at Warwick University. But the pandemic came in the spring of that year, forcing that conference to very rapidly react. It had to move on to be a fully online conference because people were going into lockdown, you couldn't move, and so on. By 2021, when my colleagues and I were hosting it, we were able to sort of look ahead and say, do we know if the pandemic's going to be over? Is the lockdown going to be over, or is it still going to be going on? So we could say slightly in advance, we could say we'll have decided by this date if we're going to go ahead with an in-person or move to online. And essentially that meant that we had a year's worth of papers written by people who had been reacting to the pandemic. And it's quite interesting because the time scale of academic papers means that it takes about 18 months minimum, 2 years to get a paper published in journals. But the conferences are much more rapid. But when we looked at the actual division of what the topics were, they were around about 25% of them were on digital topics, information technology topics. About 10% or so were on healthcare, including COVID. And healthcare operations and supply chains has always been a track within that conference anyway. 20% or so on sustainability, about 20% on the classic foundational operations and supply chain topics. But interestingly, there was about 25% that all seemed to be about responsiveness in some way. So they were either talking about preparing for the future, or complexity, or paradox, or multi-stakeholder engagement, or ambidexterity, which is the idea that you have to be able to both switch between being lean or being agile, and that notion of the kind of movement between two different states, or organizational culture. And this really sort of reflects, I think, the fact that you can have something that on the surface is about a topic such as, in the midst of the COVID pandemic, you would expect healthcare to be the topic. But actually, there's another way in which people reflect the reality of that topic, which is around how do you respond to an unpredicted and very significant change.
Professor, resilience is one of the dominant themes from your paper. But critics argue organizations merely use the term as a post-hoc justification for surviving rather than a proactive strategy. What does genuine operational resilience actually look like in practice?
Yeah, thanks for this question. There's it's interesting because resilience becomes one of those terms that people love to use now, and you always have this thing about new phrases appearing. But resilience has sort of two different meanings, really. And I can point to a paper written by one of my colleagues who's also involved in the conference, which is called Supply Chain Sustainability Trajectories and Resilience, a Learning Perspective in Turbulent Environments. And that's by Sauer, Silver, and Schleper, came out in 2022. And that highlights essentially there's two different definitions of resilience. There's a sort of classical systems theory definition, which means to return to a previous state. So if you have an equilibrium and then you're disturbed from it, how quickly can you recover back to where you were? And they call that kind of engineering definition of resilience. So something is resilient based on how quickly it can recover. The alternative definition is more of a biological definition, which in biology is known by the term homeostasis. And this means that when you're subject to a stress or a change, when you recover from it, you don't return to the state you were at previously, but you actually move to a new state that's better adapted to the changed circumstances. So one example you might give is that, you know, when you go to the gym and you lift weights and you're doing exercise, what you're doing is you're damaging the muscle tissue, but when it rebuilds stronger. And that's why, you know, you see progress. And I think when you look at the sort of innovation landscape, there's lots of examples of this that you can see, particularly in relation to something like COVID. So another environmental ecological term is when we talk about exaptation as opposed to adaptation. So adaptation is where you have a trait that's well adapted to its current context, to its environmental niche. But exaptation is where you have a trait that happens to be there that then proves to be very useful for something that then has happened. And there's a nice example of this. If you're old enough, remember in the 1980s, if you had a cassette tape and the cassette tape unspooled, then it just so happened that a pencil, which is hexagonal, was the perfect shape and size to be able to put into the reel of the cassette tape to re-spool your tape back into the cassette cartridge. So that wasn't a design, that just happened to be very useful. And this is what happens you know, with all sorts of examples, and some of them are mentioned in the paper. So, you know, video conferencing like we're doing now, if you worked for Skype in 2019 or so, you may have had an expectation that you were going to reach a certain size in maybe about 2 years. But in fact, what happened is that the video conferencing platforms hit those targets in about 2 months, because when COVID happened, everyone started using online video conferencing. And shortly after that, people going around removing telephones from the desks in offices. You know, Microsoft Teams had just sort of basically taken over desktop telephony. So that's a massive shift, not to return to a normal that was there before, but to advance into a new niche, a new opportunity. And that sort of space changing really reflects the way in which an operational process, like how do you make phone calls, is actually very rapidly responding to a changing environment.
Professor, for decades, lean and just-in-time models were the gold standard. The pandemic exposed this fragility. Do you think supply chain managers have truly changed their mindset? Or are cost pressures pushing firms back toward the same vulnerabilities?
So this is a really interesting question, because we're talking a little bit about how a concept like lean is understood particularly in, you know, widespread circles. So it's very quick for people to say there's been a crisis, it's affecting our supply chains, therefore just in time as a concept, that we should only have things delivered when we need them is clearly vulnerable. It's not viable. And just in time is one of those features of the lean philosophy, the lean operations philosophy, which says that you should attempt to eliminate waste in your processes. So we shouldn't be holding inventory that's not needed. And we should adapt our processes so that they run as efficiently as possible. Now, I think what's interesting is that you can take quite a surface level view of lean and say, well, clearly this has disrupted our supply chain, so that's bad. And in your question, you sort of, say, does this sort of repeat the vulnerability if we just go back to that model? But I think lean is a bit richer and more nuanced if you look at it in the whole. So one of the things about lean is that, yes, if things are calm and stable, then you can optimize and get maximum efficiency. And it's a nice idea to, remember that lean came out of quite a Buddhist theme in a sort of Japanese culture, to say we should look for calm and stillness, because in stillness and calm you can then build a clearer understanding of what's happening. But it also includes the responsiveness. So the point about having a just-in-time supply chain is that you're pulling things only when they're needed. So rather than predicting what your need is and pushing it and having as producing as much as you can and pushing it down the supply chain, because you're lean, you should actually be more responsive. So there might be an equally strong argument for saying, if you have a disruption, if you didn't have a lean model and you did have warehouses full of stuff, then you'd be more vulnerable because you've invested all this, money in something that people no longer want. So, if you happen to have a warehouse full of, desktop-based telephones, by 2022, you might be sending them all to the incinerator because nobody wants them anymore. So that idea that lean is necessarily bad, I think, is a bit of a surface level response. And we also have another interesting element of lean, which is that we often talk about the Kaizen continuous improvement, which means we make small little changes each time, which needs things to sort of basically stay the same. But there is a parallel or a sister concept to that, which isn't continuous gradual improvement, it's radical improvement. So it is there inherent in lean, and that's called kaikaku, where you might sort of suddenly say, everything in this factory needs to change. We're going to completely replace it with a new factory that's optimized to our new, product range or our new environmental context. So I wouldn't dismiss lean as simply as that. And I think there's a lot more to understand really about how responsive it is and how we move between those two states of calm and turbulence, just to see how we can get that balance right.
Professor, your research bridges the sustainability development goals and supply chain operations, two worlds that don't always speak the same language. What's the most sunborn barrier you see preventing firms from genuinely embedding the SDGs into their operations decisions?
Yes, I've always liked working on the SDGs because they represent a framework for a whole range of sustainable development related issues, but they've been agreed. So there's always been a problem with sustainability issues, which is, it reminds me of Humpty Dumpty in Alice in Wonderland. So in Alice in Wonderland, the character Humpty Dumpty says that words can mean whatever you want them to mean. And Alice says that's just silly. And there is that sense in which you can include so many things within the branch of sustainability that it can be pretty much anything and get quite confusing. So there was a good paper by Ahi and Cersei, I believe, which recorded something like 400 different uses of the phrase sustainability, 400 different metrics in supply chain management that were radically different. They could include everything from, investing in the kit for your local sports team through to, pollution from a factory. And what the Sustainable Development Goals do, we've got 17 goals that range from things like, end hunger, and you'd think these are all universally supported, through to build strong institutions. Now, underneath those, you've got some 170 indicators and some 230 plus metrics. And it's those metrics that I think are really interesting to get down into, because that's telling you actually what is needed to achieve those goals, or what has been agreed as the practices to achieve those goals. Now, the problem when you look at businesses reacting to these SDGs is that the SDGs were created as a government level political process, and they include an awful lot of different things. I mean, 170 indicators is vast. I mean, someone once said to me, you can't have 17 goals. That's ridiculous. You need one or two goals to be effective. You just can't. What are you talking about? And yet they were developed with business because it was recognized that business was such an important stakeholder in delivering these goals. There is that sort of connection, but you need to sort of be very clear about who's asking who to do what exactly. If you just say, oh, these SDGs are important, we should definitely be saying we're doing something, what happens is the sustainability report uses them as a series of headlines, and people say, oh yes, well, we're doing lots on gender equality, or we're doing lots on, water supply and water quality. And then you make that, some comment that you're making on progress. But what really matters is, does that actually come through into your operational decision making? Are you actually doing something that you could specifically refer back up to different organizations and say, well, we're doing this little bit on water quality in this particular location, therefore we're making a meaningful contribution to that SDG, and doing so in partnership with an idea of like, well, what country are you contributing that to? Are you talking about the role that a company makes in a particular location, or are you talking about how the company itself is performing? Because it's the first one that's really going to actually deliver an SDG, because the SDGs are things that governments report on. Therefore, they're a nation state level indicator. And if you go into those goals, you can also look at the maturity of the methodologies for different indicators. And there it's really interesting because some of them are aggregated by country, some of them are more advanced than others. So I think there's a lot more detail you can really get stuck into on this particular framework. Considering also it does contain an awful lot of stuff. So some of it is slightly contradictory, and some of it you might sort of go, well, that's a trade-off against that one. How can you have a target for increasing agricultural exports to global markets, especially from these developed countries with agricultural economies, and protect rainforests and prevent conversion of agricultural land? So those two are very much in tension if you're then working at a regional level and you're saying, well, hang on, I've got to protect my landscape and I've got to increase my agricultural output. So which one wins? So those tensions are sort of inherent. But then you can also find, one particular SDG that can actually, if you achieve that one, it will help achieve a number of others. And there was a report done by colleagues of mine in the Sussex Sustainability Research Programme for the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office on these SDG synergies, which ones are the kind of lead to focus on that may then help achieve other ones more easily. So it's a very, very rich topic. And it's worth noting that they're goals for 2030. So, we're on the home straight really and seeing how the progress is. But of course, as soon as COVID hit, basically a lot of them reversed the direction that they had been going in. COVID had a huge impact, obviously, on health, but also on the economic indicators. And if you think about the succession of kind of major global crises since then, each one of them takes a hit out of that progress for the SDGs. So if you were working on the sort of what happens next, is there going to be another set of SDGs and then reinvigoration, and should they change the structure in any way? You have to kind of look at it in the context of where those major impacts to that progress have come from, and then look at the meaningful path going forward for progress.
Professor, climate change is no longer a distant policy concern. It's now a real disruption for supply chains, from floods to heat waves. How should operations manager today be structuring the risk assessment to account for climate volatility?
Again, it's an excellent question, and I appreciate the focus on issues such as this because they are so significant. It's really an operations manager's responsibility to look at things such as what is the energy supply for that facility? If you're building a data center, are you just running on gas turbines, and therefore your climate footprint is adding on significantly to your your country's targets for carbon reduction. These sorts of issues need to be thought of seriously, and those are all examples of what you call climate mitigation. How do we reduce our contribution to climate change? The other one is land use. Very much how do you convert agriculture to be less of a source of carbon emissions, and including obviously carbon equivalents like methane or whatever. But the role of soil in holding carbon, the rate of deforestation, these sorts of issues. But I think your question is also primarily about climate adaptation, which is like how do you deal with floods and heat waves and so on. Now, we have a certain amount of that built in. It's just like people talk about this year as being the warmest on record. We could just as easily talk about this year being the coolest that you're going to experience for the next 50 years. So in a sense, that idea of what is the level of response that's needed. I think there are a suite of things that are relatively straightforward. So if we're dealing with buildings, if you're a facilities manager, you might be thinking, well, should we be painting the roofs white if they're not already to reduce the heat load? Should we be looking at the size of our drainage channels so that extreme rainfall isn't going to flood our factories? These are very, very basic kind of engineering questions. So it's a lot of what I used to do in my previous professional work. But in a sense, when you ask about the risk assessment in relation to climate volatility, this is really interesting because when we talk about risk, there's sort of two ways you can deal with risk. You can either say, that's a high risk, I don't want to have anything to do with it, and you try and relocate away from the risk. Or you say, that's a risk, we must try and mitigate that risk. Therefore, you invest in trying to reduce the impacts of that risk happening. So risk management has all these different layers, awareness of the problem, and then how do you attempt to reduce it? In supply chains generally, we see that parallel. You can have a major incident. We often talk about the Rana Plaza disaster in Bangladesh and how the response to that, you either saw companies withdrawing, they de-risked by withdrawing from that market and building factories or sourcing from factories elsewhere, or you had others that sought to practice supplier development. So they went into those locations, they improved the standards and, trying to raise the quality of the performance of the institutions and their, maintaining that relationship. So the same is true there. So do you react to climate change by trying to move to low risk environments, or do you react to it by trying to increase your capability to respond to it? And the problem when you've got a global crisis like climate change is there may not be anywhere that you can resource from because everywhere is going to get hit to different degrees. So we might then start to say, all right, well, give us a bit more detail. What is it you're talking about? Is it going to be that we've got high water dependency on a particular location so we can relocate to somewhere where that is less of a risk? Or should you be saying, no, we should be investing in better water management in that location to reduce that risk? So there's two sort of ways you could go, depending on your context.
So the paper highlights digital technologies as a significant theme emerging from the research. But many firms invest heavily in digital tools without seeing transformation. What separates organizations that genuinely leverage digital capabilities from those going through the motions?
This again is another excellent question because in a sense, we get this transformation happening as a result of digital technologies. And right now, everyone's talking about AI being this great changer of how, all operations and processes are going to be changed, and it's affecting the jobs market for young entrants and so on. And it's also producing huge capabilities for people that are really applying these tools, and lowering the barrier to entry to what used to be more expensive specialist services, for example. But we can also see a really interesting parallel if we look at work from the 1990s when you first had a very basic level of digital information technology coming into organizations. And IBM actually invested a lot in understanding these the process by which a company will start to adopt effectively desktop PCs. So I think the answer is to really appreciate that you've got to incorporate these new technologies into your operational processes. There has to be a way in which you can work with your operations managers to actually understand the role that these new technologies play in the actual processes that the organization has. And there's an example from one of my pieces of research looking at particular new digital services where people say, well, we've got this service, we've plugged it into our systems, and I get this email saying I've got an alert, but I don't have a thing to do with that information. It hadn't been fully embedded into an actual decision-making structure. So I think this is the problem, that if you look at a new technology, like a new digital system, you've really got to think about how it is integrated into the organization and who needs to be involved in that integration. And quite often, this is repeating a lot of what happened in business process re-engineering in, say, the 90s with the introduction of digital technologies, at their most basic, what now appears to be the incredibly basic level. But we're seeing this being repeated again.
Professor, the paper raises manager cognition as an important variable. With AI and data analytics flooding the decision-making space, how do human cognitive biases continue to shape operations outcomes? And can technology really overcome them?
It's really important, I think, right now that we think about new digital technologies and any changes to operations really in terms of how the decision maker understands what they're trying to achieve. So we talk about, in decision theory, we talk about two different branches. One is that you can have a lot of analytics capability, and you can use data to produce insights. But these are insights for a decision maker. It can present you with some findings, but the responsibility for making the decision still lies with the person who has to make that decision. So these are all examples of what we call decision support systems. It's supporting my ability to make that decision. So we see a lot of this with AI right now and responsibility. If the AI sort of generates a result, who's really responsible for that result being accurate and correct? And is it effective as a decision support system? How good is your training model for the AI to be able to not come up with, hallucinated results and so on? The other branch of decision theory talks about essentially cognition, the empirical behavioral aspects, which is what is the nature of cognitive bias? For example, the order in which information is presented can make people come to very different conclusions, or the way you frame it one way versus another way is literally glass half full, glass half empty kind of bias. So you can read about this in books, like Michael Pitt's Tools for Thinking, or Simon French and authors, decision analysis textbooks, which I think really help explain this idea that there are fundamental ways in which we interpret information that can manipulate us and can lead us to false conclusions through bias. Now, the idea is, can you, by being aware of that bias, try and counteract it? And the answer is yes, but you've got to be aware of it. So we have this risk with a lot of these sort of decision-making tools now, or advanced analytic tools, that we really need to understand that if the model is not well designed, it will not generate truthful outcomes, even if it might deliver valid outcomes. The model might churn out exactly the thing that you asked it to churn out, but if you built the model wrong, it's not going to give you relevant outcomes. And this is a great problem again with the risk in modeling, which is that you assume a simpler phenomenon than you're actually dealing with. You assume things are more structured than they actually are. And it's always that boundary between when things are slightly more messy. You might think that, you can round that bit off, but I go back to some of the earliest thinking around this, in particular chaos theory in the 1970s. The discovery, effectively, that if you take a nonlinear phenomena and you try and build a model and you feed some data and you average out the data, you cut off some of the minute parts of the measurement, then you can get massively different results, because you have what's called a sensitivity to initial conditions. The model itself is too sensitive to the data being slightly inaccurate, and we can amplify this now massively because we're delivering these tools at ever greater levels. So we really need us as people to be aware of how to run decision analysis better.
Professor include a discussion of epistemology, how we know what we know, which is relatively rare in operations management papers. Why did you feel it was essential to raise that question in the context of the new normal? And what does it mean for how researchers should approach future disruptions?
So, epistemology is the philosophy of knowledge. It's how do we know things? And this is really important because in operations and supply chains, at the moment, a big topic is about transparency and traceability. So that's really about saying, do you know where your stuff comes from? Do you know how it was produced? And there might be assumption that, yes, we do know, or, well, we don't know, but we could find out. But there's another element, which is to say, no, we don't know, and we can't find out. It's not possible to find that information out for various reasons. It might be practically impossible because it just costs too much to find out, or it might be literally impossible because your information is never collected by anybody, and commodities sit in warehouses and get passed around, and the data just simply doesn't exist, and you have too high a turnover, it's too dynamic, and so on. There was a theory of management strategy by William Ocasio called the attention-based view of strategy, and that was really interesting. And it said it's not enough for companies to have resources. Information could be a resource. It has to know that it's got them. It has to know it has those resources, and it has to know that and actually have a means to deploy them. It has to have people, it has to know who to bring up to say, you've got this thing, we needed to do this. So there is something inherent in the way an organization is structured, which is that it's to do with flows of knowledge and flows of information. So when we talk about the new normal as being this very turbulent time, in a sense, you've got to increase that speed at which you have the knowledge of what's happening and how to respond. And in fact, this is happening. I mean, the fact that we now have these amazing communication technologies means that we are actually responding much faster to crises that happen. In fact, in some cases, people have been surprised that things haven't been as worse as they may have thought they would be. And it's partly because we have this rapid response capability now. Now, in terms of what that means for researchers, I think it's interesting going back to those themes from the conference that those that were talking about responsiveness and complexity, these are really vital topics right now for researchers. And what does that mean for how we approach future disruptions? Well, in a way, it's always the next disruption that's the one that we need to be concerned with. And there's that phrase, the generals are always fighting the last war, that you always have this sort of mindset going back to the epistemology and the cognition, of your past experience. But when things are changing rapidly, you need to be able to have a way to respond rapidly. We see this very much with the war of Russia against Ukraine at the moment. The level of evolution of drone warfare is radically different from the expectation of warfare at the beginning. So these again are massive, sudden, innovative paradigm changes in disruption. And another nice example, when COVID was happening, there was a very useful paper by Christopher Wickett at University of Amsterdam, which was actually a study of the Ebola outbreak from some years previously, but it had been through the process and it had been published. And so they were able, when people were looking at how do we develop rapid vaccine response, they weren't coming at it new. They were saying, well, we've got this thing from over here, from Ebola, that I think this could have some useful insights from. So that's exaptation again. It wasn't by design or intention. It was by coincidence and serendipity. So those are some of the themes about how we respond to these disruptions going forward.
Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. If you are advising a global supply chain director today, not about COVID-19, but about the next Black Swan event, what conceptual frameworks from your research would you say are non-negotiable to have in place before the crisis hits?
Well, I don't know about non-negotiable, but certainly my recommendation, to a supply chain director or manager, as your question asks, I would suggest reading the paper in Harvard Business Review by Dave Snowden and Mary Boone from 2007, called A Leader's Framework for Decision Making. And you can go on Google Scholar and look this up to find it. But that model, Dave Snowden, he was working for IBM in the past, is called the Cynefin framework, which is spelled Cynefin, which is a Welsh word meaning habitat or context, or which combines the sort of the stories and narratives that shape your understanding as well as the sort of empirical experience. And the Cynefin framework is, as the paper suggests, a leader's framework for decision making. It really says, well, you've got to be aware of your context. Is your context chaotic, or is it sort of stable? And if it's stable, then you kind of know what to do just automatically, just standard operating procedures. If it's sort of still structured, but you don't immediately know, then it's something where you can understand it through some analysis. Or if it's unstructured, it either has some structure there, but you can't quite tell in advance. Or if it's chaotic, then you really need to either sort of wait until order reappears. You wait until the circumstances, change, or you try and impose order. And it's interesting that leaders often try and impose order on an unstructured situation in order to shift it back into a state that is known and can be controlled. And there's interesting examples there. where a local political leader, for example, like a city mayor, might come in a crisis and impose order and say, you need to do this, you need to do this, to all the emergency services or something. And there's other examples in literature about, how what's really important in these sort of moments of sudden change is that you have an awareness of really where things are at and where your best action is. So I've written quite a few times about the Cynefin framework and compared it back to other examples around that divide between, what is known or not known, or what is planned or emergent, and so on. So certainly that paper, Harvard Business Review, Dave Snowden, Mary Boone, thoroughly recommend it. It's designed for business managers to read. So that's my top tip. Thanks.
Professor Alexander, this conversation has been a masterclass in seeing disruption not as a setback, but as a signal to rethink how we build, collaborate, and sustain. Thank you for bringing both the rigorousness of your research and clarity of your thinking to Businesstalk. For our listeners, the questions Professor Alexander has raised today about resilience, sustainability, and how we truly know what we know are worth sitting with long after this episode ends. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning. Professor Alexander, thank you so generously for sharing your time and your expertise with us today. It truly made this conversation exceptional. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed.